for being here. Thank you, Rosanna and Javier, for joining us. We are a bit late, so start.
First of all, the methodology group for this year. And for the aim of this workshop is to discuss about the current challenges to logical pluralism. And to begin with, María Martínez-Ordaz is going to talk about the reconstructions-objection to logical pluralism.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Pamela. Thank you to the organizers, Christian and Luis. And first of all, apologies for being so late. I was, in my mind, I was ready on time, but the driver didn't think so. So, okay. The idea today is that I'm going to be integrating some methodological concerns about the use of case studies in the debate about logical pluralism. And the main idea is these concerns are very much present in ordinary discussions about provision of logic and the applicability of certain logics in order to motivate either logical pluralism or the adoption of a particular logic. So, but I'm going to try to integrate it in such a way that they are really problematic for the use of case studies in the defense or motivation of logical pluralism. So take the general idea that there is more than one correct logic, and that is the logical pluralist general thesis. So this is often motivated or supported by the evidential use of case studies. So usually you say there is more than one correct logic. Look at these examples. This example can be reconstructed using different logics in a more or less the same correct type of way. So the thesis is going to be methodological. So I'm going to be talking about a particular type of methodological concern about the use and understanding of examples in the logical pluralism debate. And the idea is that a logical pluralism that is case-guided or case-motivated or using cases as evidence faces a challenge similar to Pitt's dilemma of case studies, which is part of the philosophy of science literature. And so we end up with a picture that says the evidence obtained through the analysis risks being too specific to general conclusions about logical frameworks and their applicability, or the reconstructions and therefore the corresponding interpretations end up being too abstract to preserve contextual features necessary for successful reasoning in that particular context. So this is the main thesis. Keep that in mind. And so the plan is going to be the following one. I'm going to bring some lessons from the philosophy of science. Mostly I'm going to introduce the dilemma of case studies presented by Pitt. And then I'm going to say something about the case guidance of logical pluralism in the general debate, the dilemma of the case guided for logical pluralism, and the idea of how can we resist the dilemma, and some final remarks. So everything, I hope, is going to be very brief and very simple. Hopefully this time I can do something like that. So, the dilemma of case studies appears in the literature of integrated history and philosophy of science. And the idea is the general interpretation of what philosophers are doing with history of science is they are using it to guide their philosophical theses. They are trying to find evidence in order to motivate their philosophical understanding of whatever is happening in the history of science or in science in general. And so Pitt is going against that idea, saying that, well, sometimes philosophers don't get it right, and they are very much mistaken about what they are doing. So first, a historical reconstruction of a particular scientific episode constitutes an attempt to provide a rational understanding of a specific historical moment. Historical reconstructions are not only historical data, but also a particular way in which we put such data together. The second premise of that dilemma, I think that's not controversial for any of us. So the second premise of that dilemma is that in the philosophy of science, historical reconstructions are often used as case studies. We are using them to prove something about the scientific practice of the history of science. It is assumed that the use of case studies from the history of science can play a central role in the philosophical analysis of science. As I said, sometimes we think that if we look at enough cases studies, then we can get a general idea of what is happening there. So it motivates philosophical theses about what's happening in the history of science. But also, if we have a thesis, we also seek for some support. And we can find it in the use of case. I think none of this looks controversial. So we have two problems. The first one is evidential support. If we, when a particular case study is selected because it exemplifies a particular philosophical point, it is not clear that the historical data has not been manipulated to fit the point. That's some ontological concern about how we are using historical data. Bless you. And also, we have the other scenario when we are seeking for motivation. So when a philosopher of science starts with analyzing a particular case study, it is not clear where to go from there. But it is unreasonable to generalize from one case or two or three or five, etc. Right? So, so the conclusion in general that Pitt reaches is that even if good case studies do not philosophical work, they are at best heuristics. At worst, they give the false impression that history is on our side, the philosopher's side, sort of the history and philosophy of science version of the manifest destiny, and it is not clear what philosophical work can be done there. According to this dilemma, the dilemma of case studies, on the one hand, if philosophers have a case that is clearly not philosophically based, then it is also not philosophically relevant, right? Because it would be only a bunch of historical data in which it would be unclear what philosophical lessons we can learn. On the other hand, if philosophers have a case that is philosophically relevant, it is likely that it is also philosophically biased, because it might have been selected or tampered with the evidence to fit the philosophical point. So we don't want, even if that happens in philosophy of science, we don't want that to happen in logic, right? Now, I'm just going to change my glasses. I have an eye problem, and so sometimes it's very painful to see, and so I use these ones, but I don't like them. Okay. So let's go to see what the hell are logicians doing when searching for evidence through case studies. There is a sort of a starting point or a starting intuition, which is, we can frame it in the terms of the canonical application. So logic is supposed to provide an analysis of implication in natural language. Among other things, this analysis should allow to use logic to evaluate natural language arguments in terms of formal consequence relation. That comes from an early work by Graham Priest and has been recovered by many logicians in order to motivate the idea that there is a connection between how we reason when using natural language and what logic can tell us about the naturalness of whatever consequence relation we want to define. And then we have that idea as a starting point, and we search for evidence. So we search for evidence, and we are looking for situations where particular logical frameworks or specific logical consequence relations are typically used or can be used to satisfactorily explain natural language arguments. And we call those things examples, right? I think there is nothing controversial about whether we are doing something like that in logic or not. And then we have a next step, which is interpreting those examples or interpreting that evidence. But what does that mean? What does it mean to provide an example or an exemplar of something? So we can look at the literature in epistemology and say that when an item serves as a sample or example, it exemplifies. It functions as a symbol that makes reference to some of the properties, patterns, or relations that it instantiates. So going back to the case of logic and reasoning, we can say an exemplar is a specific case that instantiates the logical principles or rules of a logical framework. In this sense, the exemplar serves as a representative sample that makes reference to the properties, patterns, or relations characteristic of that framework that it's representing. At this point, I have to make parentheses and say that most of this methodology is going to be connected to a sort of anti-exceptionalist motivation, in which we think that the methodology for revising or motivating the revision of logic comes from evidence, as it comes in the same way in the natural sciences. So if logic is not special, then maybe the way in which we revise or motivate our revision of the logics is very similar to the way in which physicists or chemists tend to change or motivate the revision of their theories. faced with evidence and trying to evaluate whether the theories correspond or can account for that. So that's it. Let's say that we have something like cascaded logical pluralism, which is going to be using these examples that we said that we are always seeking for. So there is a central claim. Multiple logics can be adequate or correct in different domains of reason or context that we have, and we have concrete evidence in the form of examples for this. So this is what is the most important, that we have concrete evidence in the form of examples in order to defend the idea of logical pluralism. So the rationale for this motivation, or guidance, in the general case in which we are also searching for evidence, comes from analyzing particular reasoning cases and the recognizing of at least one logical framework that can adequately capture the inferential patterns illustrated by those cases. And this is taken as evidence in favor of either the applicability or the legitimacy of a particular set of logical frameworks. That is the general idea of, well, once we identify a case study, then how do we interpret it? Well, we interpret it as evidence that motivates or justifies our logical pluralism, at least with regard to that. So, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to motivate that there is an interpretation of the Pitt's dilemma in the case of logical pluralism. So, we can say that a logical reconstruction of a particular argument or reasoning constitutes an attempt to provide rational understanding of the arguments in terms of a formal consequence relation. That connects very nicely with the idea of having the canonical application for a given context, and so on. So the second premise is that the logical pluralism debates are played with case studies and their corresponding reconstructions, and the assumption that they can play an important role in motivating or providing evidence of the correctness, adequacy, legitimacy, or whatever we want to call it, of given logical frameworks. And then we have two different scenarios. We have the evidential support scenario, which is very similar and analogous to the one in history and philosophy of science. And it says that when a particular case study is selected because it exemplifies some specific logical principles, it is not clear that information has not been manipulated to fit the point. Also, we have the motivation scenario, which says that when a logician starts with analyzing a particular case, it is not clear where to go from there. For this, it's unreasonable to generalize from 1, 2, 3 cases in order to say this logical framework has been proved to be very strong or adequate in this particular context. So, on the one hand, we have the problem of this methodology of using case studies as being too specific. So if the reasoning cases that are analyzed with full attention of their contextual, if reasoning cases are analyzed with full attention to their contextual details, the conclusion about which logic applies or logical framework applies might become too specific to support any general claim about it. So it cannot motivate really a sort of significant logical pluralism. So the other option is that it is too broad. So if the case is abstracted away from its specific details and only its formal logical structure is considered, the analysis is becoming overgeneralized, misrepresenting the true complexity of the reasoning in that particular case. So we might be losing the parts of the reasoning that are connected to the context while getting a general structure. And maybe those parts of the reasoning that we are losing are the ones that are responsible for the successful reasoning carried out in that particular case. So maybe using cases doesn't help at all, and again, logicians shouldn't be doing that. So there are different ways in which we can resist the problem of the dilemma of case studies applied to logical pluralism. The first one is saying we don't do that. So we don't do the combination of these two things. When a particular case is selected because it exemplifies some specific logical principles, it is not clear that the information has not been manipulated or tempered to fit the point, and that the result is not too broad. So we can say that. However, there are certain complaints, and now I'm going to focus on the complaints against preconsistent logicians, but I think it's very easy to generalize to to see the version of these complaints in other literature. So there are people like Peter Vickers that argue against logicians, paraconsistent logicians identifying paraconsistent reasoning strategies in the history of science. And what he's saying is people like Bryson, Brown, and Graham Priest are typical of a subset of philosophy of science that assume that the early calculus can be reconstructed by making use of paraconsistent logics. To motivate the application of a particular paraconsistent logic, they adopt chunk and permeate. Clearly, this blurs some important distinctions that happen in the actual reasoning. And so the claim of Vickers is that most of the time when we are doing this analysis of the case studies, we are simplifying too much. And we are losing the historical aspects that made that reasoning in that particular context successful. So we might be doing that. And even worse, there are two main methodological missteps that are followed in the argument that is using case examples to illustrate, in this particular case, paraconsistent reasoning. So the first of all is the presumption of logical principles being evaluated or being evaluable in that particular context. In the case of paraconsistent logics, you may say principle of explosion. So either principle of explosion holds, and there is the risk of logical triviality, or it doesn't hold, and then the reasoning is paraconsistent. And also there is the presumption of logical closure for human reasoning in general. But we have some arguments against those points, and the idea is that take the examples used in favor of paraconsistent logics. The main problem with the methodological missteps of the abductive argument that we are doing there, going from a particular case to saying, oh, the reasoning must have been paraconsistent, is the following one. On the one hand, it neglects the logical constraints of human reasoning. So it is not clear for us whether there is something like logical closure that encompasses all of our reasoning together. So if any, would be of the shape of pragmatic and contextual reasoning strategies more than logical principles. On the other hand, the assumption of logical triviality or lack thereof being the most telling outcome of inconsistent reasoning fails at acknowledging the particularities of each case and their role in handling the corresponding contradictions. So we are assuming that logical triviality is an actual risk and also is a telling evidence about the reasoning that is being carried out there. And we don't have evidence for that either. So it seems that we are not doing a very good job trying to be fair at reconstructing whatever the reasoning cases are telling us. So let's say that Vickers is mistaken and people are not doing this intentionally, and we are actually trying to follow the most strict and rigorous methodology while reconstructing case studies in philosophy. So we still might have the issue of underdetermination. Specific cases can be reconstructed using different logics, raising questions about the legitimacy or generalizing from them. This indeed raises a red flag about the reliability of the case methodology used to defend logical pluralism. The existence of multiple logical reconstructions for the same case seems to support the idea that case studies might not conclusively tell us which logic or logics are correct when using or to capture in that particular case. This mirrors how Pete dilemmas raises concern about historical case studies being too flexible or indeterminate to support general conclusions in philosophy of science. So we have the other option saying we don't do that either. So we don't have underdetermination, and also we don't fall in the fourth premise of the dilemma, which is when a logician starts with analyzing particular case, it is not clear where to go from there, for it is unreasonable to generalize from 1, 2, 3 case studies. Yet, if the case is relevant, it is likely that it's also philosophically based, because it might have been selected or tampered with to make a philosophical point. And so we can go to also the literature about how we motivate the adoption of paraconsistent logics when using cases from the history of science. And we can see what Michael has to say here. So for instance, in the case of scientific reasoning, when using paraconsistent logic, this evidence in favor of paraconsistency is nothing but apparent. And it is obtained by a biased abductive argument that leads to interpret the relation between the historical record that has to show and the success of peri-consistent logics. The idea here would be that there are interesting and productive inconsistent theories from which people do not infer random unconnected conclusions. So it might be thought that the logic that is used does not license such inferences. But again, that sends us back to the idea that we don't have evidence for having logical closure, or that the logical principles as we know them should hold on that particular domain. So we can go again to see how these arguments look like, and then we can see that people like Graham Priest are saying examples of inconsistent but non-trivial theories are easy to produce. Then he comes and brings the one of Bohr's and the relation of Bohr's theory of the atom and its relation with Maxwell equations. And then he concludes the reasoning, whatever the inference mechanism it was underlied, this must have been peri-consistent. And so this is the problem that people like Michael say. So you go from something like a case study, and then you conclude something very general about whatever the hell was happening in that particular case. It's not clear that we have that type of evidence, right? From just looking at this part. And so there is another way to resist the objection, which is say, see, that happens in the philosophy of science because philosophy of science is very weird, but logic is very special. So there is a type of exceptional nature that we can say about logic, and that is going to help us to go from particular case studies to general theories. So let's say that we have something like an exceptionalist view about logic, and we say that unlike scientific or historical theories or philosophical theories, which are deeply tied to empirical content, logic is concerned with the form of arguments. So how premises relate to conclusions regardless of the subject matter. Since logic is so abstract and tends to abstract away from the content, it might escape from some of the problems associated with Pitt's dilemma. So, for instance, it has a sort of generalization potential. So logical pluralism can operate on formal patterns like valid and invalid inferences, which are independent from the particularities of empirical cases. Thus, logic might be more amenable to generalizations across cases because they capture formal features that persist regardless of the specific context. We also can say that there is something like structural universality in logic. So even if different logics explain a case in different ways, what they are focusing on are formal relations. These are arguably more universal across different domains than the scientific phenomena or that historical cases have improved in the case of philosophy. So, which are more context dependent than the cases in philosophy of logic. Yet, it seems a bit problematic because the idea was that we were seeking for evidence because we have a sort of anti-exceptionalist commitment. And so if we are going to argue that that logic is actually exceptional in the sense of how we produce and interpret the evidence, then that doesn't relate that very nicely to the initial idea that there is a continuum between the methodology that we use in the sciences to evaluate evidence and whatever we conclude about our general thesis, and the way in which we do it in logic. So while this can be an option of how to escape the dilemma, it also conflicts with the idea of why are you using case studies at the first point. So in general, today I introduce you to a methodological concern about the use and understanding of examples in the logical pluralism debate. And I wanted to say that there is a sort of dilemma that similar to Pitt's dilemma that comes by the use of case studies to motivate or to provide evidence in favor of logical pluralism. So on the one hand, we can say that the evidence obtained through the analysis risks being too specific to yield any general conclusions about logical frameworks, and on the other hand, the reconstructions and therefore the corresponding interpretations end up being too abstract to preserve the contextual features that were necessary to successfully reasoning in those particular contexts. That said, either cases are not as reliable as we tend to think. So using examples as we practice in philosophy of logic as showing, see, my claim about how the legitimacy of this logical framework in this particular context is adequate might not be as a reliable indicator as we tend to think. Or the reliability is special. The use of case studies in logic is special because of the nature of logic, because logic is special. And so thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. It's a really challenging so let me address you first on the piece.
Yep, sure.
Because I think I cannot find the dilemma for myself. I think his very argument has the feature that he is complaining that those who invoke case study has, right? It's an argument that either is too generic, and to that extent, it's unclear that it actually does justice. Or to the extent that it addresses those things, right, it fails to be specific enough and to the variety of case studies. Right? So maybe someone can say, look, obviously, as in the case of science, right, you just don't have data. Right? Every data is manipulated minimally statistically, right, so that it's stable enough, so that it can be the basis of some kind of regularly. And of course, that doesn't mean that you cannot test theories with data. Right? You test them, assuming certain things. And maybe if it turns out that the data is biased in ways that compromise the testing, well, then that's a bad testing. Right? That doesn't mean that you cannot perform the test, because often the data is not compromised. Not compromised in that way. So my suggestion proper case studies need not be vicious in the way that it suggests they are. Because you could say, look, so in the case of you are trying to understand, say, pluralism, trying to say, says, well, you look at the reasoning that Bohr was engaged, and you realize, yeah, there was electrodynamics would tell that the sort of planetary system model of the atom would be highly unstable. Right? The electrons, we just don't have enough energy to circulate. They would just crash in the nucleus in a matter of seconds. Bohr had a principle to the effect that that doesn't happen. And of course, it gives a florid description, but often, in effect, that's what it does. Now, if you take together the model and electrodynamics, there is an inconsistency. In that sense, Graham is right. There is a contradiction going there. Surface, right? Bohr did not derive it. He derived the right model of sequence. Right? So something worked. In fact, that was the only reason why people paid attention to it. Right? No one had an account. He's admittedly flawed. No. But then the question is this: how can he do what he is doing with a logic that would be explosive on the basis of a contradiction? Hence, Graham's conclusion. Somewhere, is this too general? Right? No, he's talking about the details of the model. Admittedly, he didn't get into the details, right?
But you did. We can say that you did,
yeah,
right?
I gave him on his behalf. Right? You can give a little more, if but I'm not going to talk about it, right? But you can give a little more details and say, look, it's not an unreasonable. Because the alternative is Bohr was reasoning with classical logic. The whole thing is trivial. Now tell me, how on earth did it arrive at? It looks like there is an interesting plausible case here, not for federal system logic in general, every single case, but as a possible interpretation of this case. That
problem is that it doesn't, because one of the conclusions is that case studies can be at their best heuristics and at their worst misleading, right? So that's the general conclusion of the dilemma. So what might be happening here is that, yes, you have a case study that if you analyze very thoroughly, then it comes out as an instance of a sort of inconsistency toleration reasoning. And then it's a good heuristics for logicians, but it's not actual evidence. And so I think the problem is that we often mistake the cases as being evidence in favor of a particular type of procedure or a particular type of logical framework. So in the case of work, for instance, there is your reconstruction, there is Graham's reconstruction using chunk and permeate, and there is also Vickers' reconstruction without changing logic. So what can we conclude from that? You may say logical pluralism, but the problem is that there is a sense in which one of the reconstructions is saying this has nothing to do about logic. So the idea of saying this actually supports the thesis of logical pluralism seems to be over-exaggerated, right? So at least you can say, well, see, those two tools are very useful when trying to highlight whatever the pattern can or could have been, but to go from that to say this case is actual evidence in favor of the use of these two different logical frameworks, or in general in favor of logical pluralism, that seems a bit of a stretch. So that might be the response of what it means to have the dilemma in play in the case of logical pluralism debate. That yes, you can have case studies being used as heuristics and in a sense informing your research, but that doesn't mean that they constitute actual evidence in favor of particular logical frameworks, and then in general in favor of logical pluralism.
I think that's great. So I have a suggestion. Instead of presenting this as a big dilemma, present as your own dilemma. Because what you're saying now is, look, there's a genuine underdetermination. When you try to make sense of those cases, you have this radically different reconstruction. Each one of them telling a very different story. So it's unclear what to make of it. I think that's much more interesting. You get into the nitty-gritty details of those cases, take them into account, and then you say, look, there it's unclear what to say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Antonio.
Thank you, Maria, for your talk. Thank you, Antonio, for your remarks and for being here. I have two concerns, Maria, with your presentation. The first one is that I think that I disagree with your reconstruction of this dilemma. Regarding the first one, what you call evidential support, I completely agree with Octavio that it is focused on the problem of the manipulation of historical material when we reconstruct and reconstruct the historical case. But the problem here is with cooking up historical data by doing bad history of science. But if you fulfill historiographical standards for reconstructing historical episodes, you are not facing the dilemma. So in the case of logical pluralism and using examples from formal systems to support conclusions about logical pluralism, if you attempt a strict and good criteria or standards for reconstructing the case we are using as evidence, then you don't have the first home of the dilemma as a challenge at all, I think. So I think that you have to be very precise when you are trying to use this dilemma to understand the issue of using cases vis-a-vis logical pluralism. And concerning the second horn, what you call motivation, the problem here is not that philosophers use cases that are not labeled with philosophical theory, but the problem is with hasty generalization. Even if you have 2 or 3 case studies that are labeled with a philosophical theory, for instance, logical pluralism, you have the problem of hasty generalization. And the problem is worse, and this is my second concern, because I think that we can motivate the privilege or the exceptionality of logic in comparison to history and in comparison to science regarding empirical evidence, because it doesn't have in mind empirical evidence or cases from empirical sciences. It has exclusively in mind the problem with using historical evidence. And the problem with historical evidence, when you try to generalize from cases, is that history is contingent and quite diverse. So you cannot grant a same philosophical conclusion, grant philosophical one from a case study about experimentation or the notion of observation in the 17th century, and do the same thing by appealing or drawing upon a case from the 18th century, and so on and so forth, because history is quite contingent. And you also found, you can also find a diversity and complexity between the cases you are using as an inductive base. So, and I'm not sure that we have the same problem regarding logical case studies. I think that logical frameworks are not facing with the sort of contingency that we can find regarding the history of science. What do you think?
Thanks to the answer for everybody that do not know Duvian. Duvian works on the integrated history and philosophy of science types of arguments. And so first, the idea of us being able to recognize which is the inferential pattern that governs particular pieces of reasoning, that is very debatable. So you were saying that it seems a bit clear, the scenario in the cases of logic and case studies used in the philosophy of logic debates, in contrast with the ones in the history of science and philosophy of science, general conclusions. But the problem here, as I mentioned, is that there are two methodological commitments that we are assuming when taking on board this case methodology. The first one is that there are logical principles that can be evaluable in those particular contexts. And it's not very clear that we have evidence for that. That combined with the assumption that there is logical closure in a reasoning and that we can identify it, and that it's very transparent for us to know when it starts and when it ends, that is also not clear that we can actually do it. And so we have two different cases. We have the scenarios in which we can reconstruct in abstract what the theory says, and we can assume that there is a logical consequence relation governing that theory, so, which is more related to the problem that Otavio was mentioning. In the case of Bohr, then you just look at Bohr's theory of the atom in abstract, and you see in abstract Maxwell equations, and then you say, okay, there is a conflict there. How could this person be reasoning with that? But then there is a jump. So you can do the analysis in abstract, but then you are trying to say people reason with these particular constraints, for instance, paraconsistent types of constraints. And that is not so clear how we are going to make that a case for that. So there is a sense in which, yes, it could seem that logic is exceptional and our analyses are privileged because we are talking about reasoning patterns and abstract structures. But in the end, the way in which we can recognize whether some pattern is followed or another one is followed, or in the case of Vickers, if there are other elements that are into play in order to save the reasoning, that is also very debatable how we can do it and whether we can actually do it legitimately. So in those cases, then the problem of how we are reconstructing comes to the discussion again. Because what people like Vickers were saying is, yes, these people, in order to make it clear, they are tampering the historical evidence. And that is the reason why it's very neat how Chonka permeate and the early calculus match, because yes, there is a lot of evidence that has been left aside in order to make a philosophical point about the usefulness of these particular strategies when understanding whatever happened in this historical case. So, but the main assumptions behind using case studies as a methodology is what is actually undermining that the results are going to be reliable or actually help us to make any type of generalization about whether a logical framework holds in that particular case or not. So against the exceptionality of logic is also that, yes, that might be the case, but we still have to deal with these two problems. So, but thank you very much.
Gracias, muchísimas gracias, me encantó platicar, ya que estoy prácticamente convencido. Tengo que hablar en inglés, ¿verdad? I had forgotten. So yeah, I love it. Great, and I'm almost like eased from being completely convinced. So I'm gonna try to push you to even more hardcore, yeah. Because I want to start where you left off your reply to Dubian, which is that why did you frame so much of it on the anti-exceptionalist framework if you yourself recognize this is a problem that applies also to exceptionalists, right? This is if you're an exceptionalist, you still have to deal with the problem of application and the problem of counterexamples. And maybe you don't call it generalization because that sounds too anti-exceptionalist. You call it formalization, but it's the very same problem. For a matter. So my question is whether I'm wrong or why you made such a sharp distinction between exceptionalism and anti-exceptionalism.
Because I think that one of the motivations that we have to use case studies comes from the idea that there is a continuum between the methodology that we use in science and other disciplines regarding evidence and the methodology that we have in logic. It might be the case that when you are looking at the debates between anti-exceptionalists and exceptionalists about logic, then both parts are using case studies. But what we can say is they do a larger work in favor of the anti-exceptionalist perspective because they are actually gathering evidence. What the others can say is, yes, that looks nice, instantiated in an exemplar, but it doesn't mean that it tells us a lot about the legitimacy or not of that particular logic. So yes, you have the problem of applicability, but the problem can be treated in general or can be treated by appealing to particular examples. And so in the case of the anti-exceptionalist, if you are really committed to the idea that there is a continuum between how we evaluate and what we conclude from evidence, then this is a very clear problem for them. So I think the exceptionalist still can argue a bit against adopting the dilemma as problematic for them, but yeah.
You know, because if you read it, you go to all the literature, right? All the debate, intuitionist and examination, it was just like that. They also had, they wouldn't call it case studies, but it was case studies, right? But yeah, I mean, you're completely right that these people are even more explicit. But I just think that all these.
But it's problematic for the general debate between.
For the very same reason. But,
thank you, Axel.
But thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Super interesting. I think I have like two short questions. One was already sort of covered by Octavio and Dubian. So maybe just I can eliminate another aspect by putting it this way, which I think was Octavio already said. But why specifically Pitt's dilemma, not the general issue of the underdetermination of theory by evidence, if you're thinking of case studies as potential evidence under a certain understanding of the nature of logic? That's one, because in that case, of course, there's the general issue of evidence being potentially biased or theoretically charged or laden, and there's certain methodological safeguards that apply in the general case, which is the scientific case, other than the specific issue of philosophy of science being based on a history of science, which is a very particular issue, and not the general issue of the determination of theory by evidence. And the other question is, about, if you could say a little bit about what you think about the distinction between the normative and the descriptive character of the patterns of argument that are studied in these case studies, because I was just thinking, and I know nothing about these issues, but I'm thinking, for instance, in the case of Bohr, he didn't embrace the contradiction, did he? Either he did not realize there was a contradiction there, then because of those limits of psychology and reasoning, he did not derive all of the every proposition from that, or he noticed it and thought it was a problem to be solved, not embracing it either. So I'm not sure. I don't know the historical data on this, but it doesn't seem that we finding a contradiction in the reasoning unless you think that, however people reason, their psychology of reasoning and arguing is going to be a basis for a logic, right? We have to distinguish mistakes, errors from correct reasoning. And once you do that, I'm not sure it follows. So you illuminate me about these things, where I'm going wrong.
So first, why do I relate to the dilemma of case studies? And this is something very personal, that I interpret the dilemma of case studies as a real challenge for philosophy of science. So what it's saying in worst case scenario is that we don't have any way to manage evidence. We have no training, we have no clarity about how we deal with the evidence. And so our philosophical theses, it's not clear whether they are just science fiction or philosophy of science. So in that case, that's my main concern about how we extrapolate it to philosophy of logic, because we want to say that we identify evidence, but we also don't want to say yes, but we also tamper with it, I just want to make my point. So we don't want to say that. And if we can find cases of that, then it's very hard to not generalize as a hypothesis of how logicians are working with evidence. So that is the reason why I decided to connect it so explicitly with the dilemma, because I think that the challenge against the profession in the case of philosophy of science is very strong. And so we should be very worried about going that direction in the philosophy of logic debates. So that on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think, if I am not mistaken, your explanation is very much aligned of the Bohr case with Bicker's explanation. So what he is saying, I think it's about degrees of belief in the case of Bohr, right? Isn't it?
Well, you mean Vickers?
Yes.
Yeah. He wants to deny that there was any contradiction.
Yes. So the idea is that if you assign different degrees of belief, then there is a sense in which Bohr wasn't committed to both parts of the contradiction in the same degree, and so they were not actually conflicting. There was something that was taken as hypothetical or possible or something, and something that was taken more seriously. And so that is one of the interpretations that we can have for some of the most salient cases of inconsistency toleration in sciences. But also the problem is that you also have people like Ottavio doing a reconstruction of that as being actually problematic and having a legitimate contradiction, because formally there was a contradiction. So how can you not see it? And if you saw it, how can you pretend that it's not there and keep being rational? So you can say, Bohr wasn't a rational agent, but that sounds also very, very peculiar. And we don't want to say something like that, right? So, and that methodology can extend to the large majority of cases that we can find when analyzing reasoning. You have an interpretation that says you don't need to change logic. This is not a matter of logic. And you also have interpretations that say it is a matter of logic, and you can identify these patterns and see that justifies the adoption of a particular type of logical framework. And then within that particular type of logical framework, different people are going to come and say, oh yeah, it's my framework. And so the problem is that happens actually in our current practice of how we identify and understand and use exemplars in order to make philosophical points about the usefulness or the applicability of particular logical frameworks. So, but thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Maria. My question is also a follow-up, because I was worry about the way in which case studies are considered without taking into consideration psychology. So they seem to depend on how, I mean, for me at least, one way of understanding what is going on is a problem in psychology, and you can try to figure out how people can still be considered to be rational. And some people consider that, people are fragmented, so there are some propositions that are whole at some point and some others at some other points, but typically they don't go hand by hand or some sort of compartmentalization by many things. Of course, when we reconstruct the case and we consider all the evidence, we're going to find these contradictions, but the way in which they were reasoning was not on the basis of these. That's one possibility. I don't know, and maybe that doesn't even make sense because of some reason. But at least for the cases that you were mentioning, I mean, I know that it's just with your case, and I'm not very familiar with all the details, but it seems that in many of those cases, a psychological explanation of what is going on is available, and it's not considered at all. It doesn't seem to play a role when we do history of science. If we do history of science without considering psychology or what are the processes that people might be undergoing. I don't know whether this makes sense to you.
Yes. So exactly the case of compartmentalization is one of the neatest connections between logic psychology and formal epistemology in the case of reconstructing case studies. So formal compartmentalization can be of the form of something like chunk and permeate that Vickers is claiming that they are just putting it on the exemplar, right? But that actually connects with how we tend to believe that we reason. And that's also their idea when providing this particular type of methodology. They say, yes, in the large majority of cases, when you are aware of having a problem, not necessarily a contradiction, what you do is compartmentalize. And so in those cases, the formal strategy can help you to do that and also highlight the ways in which you dealt with the problem, even if you are not aware of that. Because that's also a problem when bringing psychology. It can be a sense in which we think we know what we are doing, but what we are actually doing is something different. So logic doesn't want to recover only the psychological testimony or story that everybody individually can provide, but it also wants to identify general patterns that are followed in particular types of reasoning. So the case studies illustrate those cases of reasoning, but are not the only cases of those general structures, right? So in the case of inconsistency toleration, you also have not only the interpretation of the case, but also the interpretation of the formal tool. So you can say, in the case of compartmentalization and chunk and permeate, you say, well, there are two different commitments that you can endorse. You can be very committed to this chunk and very committed to this other chunk, but you are not committed to the relation between them, for instance. So you are never using that. And then there is a psychological or epistemological interpretation of whatever the structure is telling you about the case study. For instance, I like partial structures because I think they can help you to model how ignorance comes into play in these cases. So you can also model these things that you believe are uncertain, but are still part of the reasoning, even if you don't have a very strong commitment towards them. And so the problem is, yes, you can put psychology or epistemology into play when trying to identify and explain the reconstructions, but you still have the same problem. It's not very clear that we are identifying a reasoning pattern that is transparent to the logician, that is privileged in the sense that we are actually making a salient case in favor of this particular logic, and also that our later interpretation of how the strategy or the formal tool or the logical framework relates to the evidence is adequate. So we still have a lot of methodological problems, even if we incorporate psychology, epistemology, and history of science.
It's just because the Barr case is quite interesting. What he did, he invented what he called stationary state. And he said, look, electrodynamics only applies between stationary states. At stationary states, it doesn't. And this is just a very sort of flowery way of saying thermodynamics does not apply in general, period. The question is, there's no evidence for that, right? So on the face of it, what he did was he recognized the inconsistency and just said it's not going to happen, right? So, and of course, he knew that the model was not perfect. He wasn't embracing contradiction. He was telling a story to say, okay, here's how we can handle the apparent contradiction. But this is no way of handling it. Right? That's the issue, right? Now, I do think Axel is right when he said that Maria's point applies, whether you're an exceptionalist or not. Right? So I think it's much more general in that sense. So what's interesting about the old debates, the exceptionalist ones, often when you're dealing with those logical debates, people assume that there's some shared logical principles. And that always happens, right? And they use those shared principles to reason about those that are controversial. In that way, the debate can go forward, right? So there are cases, they are providing cases, right? But I think the cases are more informative than Pitt.
Thank you, Maria. I would like to know a little bit more. How do you see the role of exemplars? Why? Of course, we don't want to build logics for particular cases. And by the way, I like very much how you raised the problem of using case studies to make claims. But instead of thinking of particular case studies or ad hoc kind of studies, we would like to see exemplars. So what do you think this could be a way? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in the medical profession, when they teach clinical research, they don't really use particular or even real clinical cases. Of course, but their exemplars are built around real clinical cases. So do you think logicians could do something like this?
Absolutely, yes. And because I have very strong structuralist view regarding understanding. So what I think is happening here is that these case studies as exemplars of particular logical frameworks or particular patterns of inference, they are actually promoting the understanding of whatever the logical framework is actually telling us. So I do believe that is their epistemic role. But the problem is that when we gain understanding about what a logical framework is telling us, sometimes and most often than never, we tend to confuse that as evidence. So we can have been using these case examples to make a point about how the inferences could look like, but often we tend to believe that they are evidence in favor of a particular logical framework or a particular philosophical view about logic, and so we have to commit to that view. And I think that is not the case. What I think is they actually illustrate how the structure looks like of an inference pattern or a logical consequence relation in a particular type of situation, but that doesn't mean anything more than that. So yes, they help us to understand better, and absolutely they show that we understood what our logical framework is telling us, or maybe they reveal something to be gained about understanding for ourselves when we put a structure in a particular context or a particular situation, but that doesn't mean that they work as evidence. I think that is my main point here. I don't think I don't want that, but I think the problem in the debates is that they are evidence. So, thank you.
It's